The internet is a vast, endless archive of human experiences. Some fascinating, some horrifying, and others so strange that they leave you with more questions than answers. In today's episode, it's those cases that we'll be taking a closer look at. These are some of the strangest and most unsettling true stories I've happened to come across. Each story you're about to hear has been documented through countless articles, reports, and first-hand accounts. But just because there's evidence doesn't mean we have all the answers. Some of the details remain uncertain, and some questions may never be resolved. I hope that you remember that as we dive right in. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed one day. That sterile hospital smell fills your nose. The constant beeping of machines around you. Your eyes flutter open, doing what they can to adjust to that bright fluorescent lighting. That's when a nurse leans over and asks, "Sir or madam, do you know your name?" You open your mouth, but the words don't come. You have no idea who you are, where you are, or how you got there. Now imagine that when you finally do speak, the words that come out aren't even in your native language. Now, this isn't the setup for some psychological thriller. This really happened to a man named Michael Boatwright in 2013. But Michael wasn't a victim of a coma or a head injury. No accident, no documented trauma. One day, he was a run-of-the-mill 61-year-old American man living his life. The next, he had no memory of who he was and could only speak fluent Swedish. And no one, not doctors, not police, not even Michael Boatwright himself, could explain why. On February 28, 2013, staff at the Desert Regional Medical Center in Palm Springs, California, found themselves dealing with a strange case. An older man had been discovered unconscious in a motel room. There was no immediate sign of injury, no drugs or alcohol in his system, also no identification on him. He was found unresponsive and alone in the room. Paramedics took him to the hospital, where he eventually regained consciousness, but when he did, this is where the oddities began. He had no idea who he was. He didn't recognize his own reflection, and he couldn't tell doctors anything about his past. When asked basic questions in English, he would stare blankly at whoever was speaking, seeming as if he didn't understand a word. Then he began to talk, although not in English, in fluent Swedish. Even though all available records confirmed that this man was an American, he spoke, thought, and behaved like a native Swede. When authorities finally identified him using fingerprints, they found out that he was a 61-year-old retired U.S. Navy veteran from Florida named Michael Boatwright. But when they told him his name, he flatly rejected it. He claimed his name was Johan Ek, and that he wasn't from Florida. He was from Sweden. It was clear that this was more than just memory loss. This man had had a complete identity shift. Before he became a mystery patient in a California hospital, Mr. Boatwright had lived a relatively normal, though somewhat nomadic life. He was born in Florida in 1952, served in the U.S. Navy, and had spent years working as a tennis coach. He had traveled a lot during his life, had a few failed relationships, and at some point had even spent time in Sweden back in the 80s and 90s. But despite having that one tie to the country, he was never fluent in the language. There was no obvious reason why his English would completely disappear and be replaced by Swedish. Even more bizarre, any hint of an American accent was gone. Doctors, nurses, and speech pathologists noted that when Boatwright spoke, he didn't sound like someone who had learned a second language. He sounded as if he'd been speaking this way his entire life. It was as if the entire existence of Michael Boatwright had been erased and replaced by a completely different person. Yet, after doctors ran all the tests they could, there was no evidence of brain damage, a stroke, or dementia. Nothing that would easily explain how something like this could happen. Doctors finally diagnosed him with transient global amnesia, or TGA, and dissociative fugue, two rare conditions that involve sudden memory loss and, in extreme cases, the formation of completely different identities. It's worth noting that even among cases of dissociative fugue, this case was even more unusual. Most people with dissociative fugue eventually recover their memories. Their true identity eventually resurfaces. But in the case of Michael Boatwright, those things never occurred. This was not just a case of someone waking up confused for a few hours or few days. This was a permanent mental shift. What's more, he never once wavered on his name being Johan Ek. His Swedish fluency never faded, and his past as an American never returned to him. With no memory of his life before this, Boatwright was stranded. Authorities couldn't find any living relatives to help him. He had no known family, no home, and basically nowhere to go. For a while, he was placed in a homeless shelter in Palm Springs. He was given some assistance, but it was clear that he had nowhere to belong. His Swedish identity didn't exist in any official capacity, and his American identity, well, that meant nothing to him. He was a man without a past, without a future, and clearly without a home. Journalists eventually caught wind of this bizarre case, and for a brief time, he became a viral mystery. The Swedish media picked up on the story, and Boatwright was even interviewed. And yes, it was completely in Swedish. Still, after all the attention that his story got, no one could explain how this had happened. Unfortunately, even with his newfound celebrity status and the efforts of others to help him, Boatwright's life never fully recovered. In December of 2014, about a year and a half after waking up as a new man, Boatwright passed away at the age of 62. To this day, it's not exactly known how he passed, given that his death was never widely reported, and no family ever came forward to claim his remains. His story simply faded away. The man who woke up as Johan Ek, the man who spent his final years insisting that he was not Michael Boatwright, died without ever being able to remember the life that he had lost. More than 10 years later now, we're left to wonder what really happened to Michael Boatwright. Was this truly a rare case of dissociative fugue, triggered by something that we may never understand? It's likely that we'll never know, but I'm interested in what you think about this case. What we do know is that somewhere in Florida, there's a birth certificate with the name Michael Boatwright on it. And yet, the man whose birth certificate that was, the man who died back in 2014, the man who took his last breath believing himself to be someone else, went to his grave as Johan Ek, a man with no past, no home, and leaving us with no real answers. On the morning of September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Schaumburg, Illinois, a small township near Chicago, woke up feeling sick, and like most kids her age, she went to her parents and told them she wasn't feeling well. They did what any parent would do. They went to the medicine cabinet, grabbed a household staple, and gave Mary one extra-strength Tylenol capsule to help her with her symptoms. It should have been nothing of note. This is something millions of people take every day without a second thought. But just a few hours later, Mary would be dead. At that exact same time, about 10 miles north of Schaumburg, 27-year-old Adam Janis, a postal worker, also found himself reaching for a Tylenol, hoping to ease a headache. But within minutes of taking the pill, he collapsed on the ground. Within a half hour, Adam was at a hospital, where he would die soon after. Later that day, Adam's family would get together at his house in Arlington Heights, just trying to process the sudden and unexpected death of their loved one. Under the weight of this tragedy, Adam's brother Stanley and his wife Teresa both took Tylenol from the same bottle that Adam had, and within hours, they were gone too. Just like that, 3 members of the same family, gone in an instant. And no one knew why, but it would be clear shortly that this was far from an accident. Elsewhere in the Chicago area, more people were dying under equally bizarre and horrifying circumstances. 35-year-old Mary Lynn Reiner, a mother of 4 from Winfield, Illinois, took Tylenol to help her recover after giving birth to her 4th child. She would be found dead in her home. 31-year-old Paula Prince, a flight attendant, stopped at a Walgreens in Chicago to grab a bottle of Tylenol after a long work trip. She was found in her apartment days later, an open bottle of Tylenol sitting right there on the bathroom counter. And unfortunately, the list goes on. 27-year-old Mary McFarland took Tylenol while at work in Elmhurst, Illinois. She collapsed soon after and died before anyone even knew what had happened. All of these cases were happening within hours of each other, all in the greater Chicago area. At first, no one had any clue about what was going on. Was it a bad batch of Tylenol? A contaminated supply, maybe? It wasn't until investigators put all the pieces together that they learned that someone was actively poisoning Tylenol. The deaths weren't accidents. They weren't bad luck. They were murders. A toxicology report confirmed that the victims had ingested Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide, a lethal poison that cuts off the body's ability to absorb oxygen. A single dose is enough to kill a person in short order. But the scariest part about this whole thing? The poisonings weren't happening at the factory. It turned out that the tainted Tylenol bottles came from multiple stores in the area, meaning someone had to have bought them, tampered with them, and then put them back on the shelves for random, unsuspecting people to purchase. There was no pattern to the stores, no pattern to the victims. It was pure, indiscriminate terror. Authorities moved fast, though. They issued urgent warnings to the public, telling people to stop taking Tylenol immediately. They flooded stores, pulling every single bottle off the shelves. This would be the first time in U.S. history that an over-the-counter medication had become a weapon of mass murder. At the center of this disaster was Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol and one of the most trusted brands in America. Instead of denying responsibility or attempting to downplay the situation, the company did something that no one expected. 31 million bottles of Tylenol were immediately recalled, costing the company well over $100 million. Johnson & Johnson also completely shut down production of Tylenol. They offered to replace all Tylenol capsules in the market with safer, solid tablets. They even introduced the first ever tamper-proof packaging, the same safety seals we see on medications today. Before this incident, what would eventually be called the Tylenol murders, medications didn't have safety seals. Bottles were sold with just a cotton ball inside, making them extremely easy to open and manipulate. From that moment, the US government made tamper-resistant packaging a requirement for all over-the-counter drugs. This case literally changed how we buy medicine. With the entire country in shock now, the hunt for the person responsible was on. The FBI, local police, and federal investigators all launched an intense manhunt. They examined thousands of leads together, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and tested countless Tylenol bottles from different stores. They found a handful of other poison bottles out there, but no solid evidence to track down the killer. That's when they got a lead. Actually, the lead landed right in their laps. A man named James William Lewis sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson, claiming he would stop the poisonings in exchange for $1 million. This letter made Lewis public enemy number 1. Authorities arrested him immediately. I mean, he had admitted to poisoning all these meds, right? But there was a huge problem. There was zero physical evidence linking him to the actual poisonings. Turns out that he likely had absolutely nothing to do with them. He was simply trying to extort the company. Lewis was a con artist and had a long criminal history. And no matter how much the police wanted to pin this tragedy on him, they couldn't prove he was the one who tampered with the bottles. They had nothing to tie him to it. Lewis was ultimately convicted only of extortion and sentenced to 13 years in prison. And with that, the case remained open. To this day, no one has ever been charged with the Tylenol murders. There have been theories. Some investigators still believe James Lewis was responsible, but without any proof, it's just a theory. Others think the killer was someone who wanted to cause chaos, knowing that there was no way that this could be traced back to them, and they would never be caught. But the most chilling possibility of all, the real killer may have simply stopped after the national panic. They may still indeed be out there. 4 decades later, the Tylenol murders are still one of the most terrifying unsolved crimes in American history. It wasn't just random cases of murder. It was a fundamental attack on public trust. It forced people to question something they had never feared before. The idea that something as simple as taking a painkiller could be the last thing that you ever do. Even today, new investigators still revisit the case, looking at old evidence with new technology, just hoping to catch a break. But for now, the person who poisoned Mary Kellerman, the Janus family, and several others, got away with murder. And unless new evidence ever emerges, they always will. In the early 2000s, Blake Ruff, a quiet, soft-spoken man from Texas, met a woman named Lori Erica Kennedy at a Bible study group. At first glance, Blake was rather taken by Lori. She was intelligent, polite, well-spoken, but also unusually private. She didn't make any small talk, didn't have close friends, and in all their conversations, she never shared anything about her past. For Blake, this wasn't necessarily a red flag. He came from a traditional and well-respected family in Texas, and he was drawn to her shy but serious nature. They started dating, and though Blake's family found Lori a little odd, they trusted his judgment. But just as the relationship started, the first signs that something wasn't quite right would start to show themselves. Whenever the topic of Lori's childhood came up, she would shut it down immediately. She never talked about parents, siblings, or an extended family. She refused to talk about where she had grown up. She even gave vague answers about her education. Specifically, not ever naming any of the schools that she attended. Even simple questions, things that normal people would share without hesitation, made her uncomfortable. Blake, wanting to respect her privacy, didn't push, but that didn't mean that his family wouldn't. When they asked Lori about her past, she became defensive, even hostile. It was as if she had built an impenetrable wall between herself and anyone trying to get to know her. But despite their unease, Blake and Lori got married in 2004. The Ruffs, a tight-knit family, welcomed her as best as they could, but deep down, they sensed that something was off. After the wedding, Lori and Blake moved to Leon County, Texas, where they started their new life together. But marriage only seemed to amplify Lori's secrecy. She would isolate herself, rarely speaking to neighbors or even attempting to make friends. She refused to attend family gatherings and, over time, distanced herself completely from Blake's relatives. Even when she got pregnant and gave birth to their child in 2008, her behavior didn't change. And if anything, it only got worse. Lori would never let anyone babysit her child. She kept every document, photo, or personal belonging under lock and key. She even became paranoid, installing multiple locks on doors as if she feared someone was coming for her. Blake's family did all they could to be patient, assuming she had a troubled past, one that she didn't want to discuss. But after 6 years of marriage, Blake couldn't take it anymore. The secrecy, that emotional distance, the paranoia, it all became too much. In 2010, he filed for divorce, and that was something that Lori didn't take well. In December of 2010, just months after Blake filed for divorce, Lori drove to the Ruff family's home in Longview, Texas. She parked in her former in-laws' driveway, sat inside her car, and then took her own life with a single gunshot to the head. The decision to end her life in front of her in-laws' home wasn't random. Many believe that it was her final message, a way to stick it to a family that never really accepted her. But Lori's death would only be the beginning of the mystery. When Blake's family got around to sorting through her belongings, they uncovered some things that I don't think they were expecting to see. In Lori's closet, hidden behind clothes and boxes, Blake's family found a locked strongbox. Inside of it were documents that proved Lori Ruff had been living under a stolen identity for decades. The name that she had met her husband Blake under, Lori Erica Kennedy, wasn't her given name. In fact, there was no record of that person existing before the year 1988. Among the contents of the strongbox, they also found an old Social Security card under the name Becky Sue Turner. They also found a birth certificate with the same name, along with a document that showed Becky Sue Turner legally changed her name to Lori Erica Kennedy in 1988. At first, this seemed like a breakthrough. Maybe the family had uncovered Lori's true name. But when investigators searched for Becky Sue Turner, they found something rather unsettling. The real Becky Sue Turner had died in a house fire in 1971 at the age of 2. Lori had stolen the identity of a dead child in order to create a new life. But that only kicked up the question: if she wasn't originally Becky Sue Turner, then who was she really? The discovery of Lori's false identity led to one of the most baffling investigations into stolen identities in modern history. To her credit, this woman managed to erase her real past completely. She legally changed her name using a dead child's identity, and she lived under a false name for over 20 years without anyone noticing. But despite years of digging, investigators couldn't actually find out who she was. She had left no fingerprints in any databases. She had no medical history before 1988, and she had no family that ever came looking for her. For years, she remained a complete mystery. But then in 2016, nearly 6 years after her death, the enigma of who this woman actually was finally solved. With the help of forensic genealogists as well as DNA testing, investigators were finally able to trace Lori's biological roots. Her real name was Kimberly McLean, and she was originally from Pennsylvania. While I don't mean to disappoint, her story wasn't what many people expected. She wasn't a fugitive. She wasn't running from a crime or an abusive relationship. But instead, at the age of 18, she had simply walked away from her family, cut off all contact, and used this as a springboard to completely recreate herself. Her parents had divorced when she was a teenager, and after a falling out with her mother and her stepfather, she vanished in 1986. She told her family she was leaving and never coming back, and it seems like she meant it. From that moment on, she started a new life, first by stealing the name Becky Sue Turner, then by legally changing it to Lori Erica Kennedy, and later becoming Lori Ruff when she married Blake. For over 2 decades, she lived a double life, and because she carried her secrets to the grave with her, we'll likely never get answers to the questions that we have. The Lori Ruff case stands as one of the strangest identity mysteries out there. The biggest question still remains, why? Why would an 18-year-old girl from a normal, middle-class family go to such extreme lengths to erase her own identity? Why did she never reach out to her real family again? The only person who truly knew the answer to these questions is no longer on this planet. Most people who go missing want to be found, but Lori did the opposite. She made sure no one would ever trace her back to her past. Thanks to science, we now know her name, but we'll never know why she did it. And maybe that's exactly what she wanted.